Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tejaswini Seagar. Today, I, along with my fellow classmate Saurabh Chaudhary, welcome you all for the webinar on travel and built environment, perceptions and learning. I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Architect Leena Gupta. Architect Leena Gupta graduated with top honors from the School of Architecture, CEPT, Ahmedabad and ETH, Zurich, and has been practicing architecture for 25 years now. Presently, she is Associate Dean, International Practice in Habitat Design of Design Village, Noida. She has been doggedly striving to align the industry and the education system. She is connected with RAIN Center in Chennai and has illustrated and edited Self-Reliance in Water, a manual for urban dwellers in 2008. She is the principal architect at Delhi's the Design House has successfully delivered over 400 projects of varied scales and typologies. She is also associated with many reputed institutions like SPA New Delhi, Vastukala Academy, Jama Millia Islamia, and MBA School of Architecture and Planning. We are glad you can join us today and we welcome you, ma'am. Now, I would like to welcome Director of our department and moderator of this webinar, Dr. Ila Gupta. She is an architect planner with specification in earthquake disaster management. She works as consultant for organization like for, UNDP, Government of Punjab, and Ministry of Home Affairs, Government of India. Formerly, she has worked as director in MBA School of Architecture and Planning, IP University, New Delhi, and as head of PhD program at Sushant School of Art and Architecture, Gurugram. I would also like to introduce the coordinator, architect Dilip Singh Kushwaha. He is an architect and environmentalist planner. He has more than 10 years experience in architecture and planning field. Now I request Dr. Ila ma'am to welcome our today's guest.
Thank you so much, Tejaswini. I extend a very hearty welcome to you, Architect Leena Gupta. I'm glad you accepted to interact with us today. So we have been planning this session for quite some time, but then we had our academic calendar and Leena ma'am always had her travel calendar with her, which used to be very hectic. But because of now the COVID times, I think her travel plans are little not so tight as earlier, and now we could catch her for this talk. So I know Architect Leena for past 7 years, and I am so happy to welcome her here today. So I can see most of the participants who have joined are students of architecture, most of them, and even faculty of architecture. So most of the students, you are still learning what architecture is, what creativity is. And let me tell you, everybody's journey in architecture is different. We have been in the field of education for so long. We always seen that every child perceives architecture in his or her own way. Some people have a very pragmatic thinking. Some are theoretical. Some feel passionate in the beginning and then lose interest. Some actually are not so interested, but after that they will become very passionate. So everybody has their own inspirations, their own journey. But what combines all of us together, or what is common between all of us here, is the creative thinking, which we all must have, and that gets developed. The design process is always there, which requires you to think new, think big, and you have to work hard towards your ideas, towards fulfilling your ideas and making them possible. So we keep getting inspirations in the process, and this lecture, I think this talk from ma'am is all about getting inspirations while we travel. So it's about keeping your eyes and ears open and welcome every experience that comes your way, because I totally believe every experience you have is unique and it is valuable. So I know Leena ma'am is a very passionate speaker, and I always enjoy listening to her whenever she talks. So I won't talk much, and I think we should start. I request her to start her presentation now.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you, Ila, for those kind words. Ila and I go back, like she said, a pretty long way. And I think some of the best times that I've had teaching was when we taught together, we took studio class together. And it always tells me that teaching is a very collaborative, venture, and it's also something where we are also constantly learning. Uh, for me, I think today I thought that I could just kind of talk a little more about what I had seen in my travels. I travel a lot. I like work so hard through the year. I save up, and then I make sure it's the one kind of luxury that I give myself. I don't give myself any other luxuries. I'm a very moderate person. So before I really start on to the travel part of it, a very brief journey of, like she said, what architecture has meant for me. And I think I realized very, very young, as a very young child, almost when I began to understand the power of space making, that architecture was my calling in life. It was not going to be just a job. It's never been a career. It's not even been just a profession. It has been my life. And I think I've been in conversation with both natural and man-made environments from the time I was 5, 6 years old, and I'm 50 now. So what I want to share with you is this journey, in architecture as I grew up and as I started practicing and I started traveling and teaching. And I call them my aha moments. Let's leave the word Eureka to Archimedes, because, the image of him kind of, not so exciting. So, and I hope that, in some small ways, they might be useful to you and they may inspire you. I've come to believe that the nature of our practice as architects is hugely not only just, kind of molded, but is pretty much directed by our conditioning. And what do I mean by conditioning is what happens at a personal or an individual level, something that happens at a cultural level, and then something that happens at a universal level. Clearly, the personal is a subset of the cultural, which is in turn a subset of the universal. And we are constantly, like Ila said, observing and analyzing. It's human instinct to always keep noticing things to varying levels of interest or intelligence. But then every human being constantly observes and analyzes and infers and draws conclusions and makes up theories. And for us architects, you have the added responsibility of also applying these understandings of our context, of whatever is happening around us in our work, and that's how we bring the value to our work. When I say personal level or at an individual level, I think what I mean is where we are born, how our parents are, what kind of family background we have, which city we have lived our formative years, what kind of school we went to, our teachers, our friends. And of course, the next big step would be the college or, the institution where you formally studied architecture. All these shape our individuality as designers, and it's not always about a response to a context, but it's also about our style, our personal vocabulary, our material palette choice, and the choice of certain kind of elements and certain vocabulary of design is all shaped by our conditioning in our formative years. Now, I was very fortunate to have been born and brought up in a very picturesque, modern, design township in South Gujarat, where Pandit Nehru had set up many industries along this very fertile belt. So we grew up around hills and forests and lakes and rivers. There was a river, there was even the estuary and the ocean. And so we grew up, in the midst of a lot of wilderness. And I think my initial shaping of space was hugely directed by this environment. I mean, we grew up practically on the tree. My brother and I, we were always up in the tree, mango tree in our garden, or any tree that we could climb. And we had to be literally yanked, to go to sleep. So we had our food there, we would do our homework, whatever we could do up in the tree, we did. And we grew up also to cohabit or coexist with insects and even snakes and spiders and birds and peacocks and all kinds of animals that would venture from from the wilderness into environments close to our house. This, along with Lego, is what I think made me decide that space making is what I want to do in my life. because this place where my father was working was a Scottish collaboration. So he would travel often to Britain, and I would always ask him to bring back Lego. And I never asked for clothes or toys or, even chocolates. And with this extensive set of Lego, I was always building, streets and institutions and cities, and imagining, a built environment on the veranda that we had. And I think that, the Lego to me always reminds me of how I was already into space making at a very young age. And that power of space making that I had as I grew up, the understanding I had was translated into my work. So this is my first project. It was a twin bungalows that I designed for a house, for a family who had resettled from Rajasthan. And they of course wanted some kind of cognitive association, and the project had already been messed up by some other architect. हाँ, हमारा ऐसा भी होता है. So when it came to us, it was a boxy kind of thing. So we were working on massing it. But my role in this project was also hugely to develop what I call as the micro environment around the building, every aspect of the landscape. So in those days, we used to make plans like this, with paper, on paper, and with the rotring ink pens. And you can see that the box, like, if you see my cursor, it's a very rectilinear building. But then I thought, to break the symmetry and to break the rigidity, I would have completely free flowing curves on the hard landscape and in the soft landscape. And it became a place where every little nook and corner, every tree was conserved, and every part of the site was completely covered in greenery, as much as I could. I also learned how to frame the view of nature. So this is in the initial years, when it was just about developing. Now it's practically a forest, and the building sort of, it gets hidden in the entire greenery. Also, I started practicing horticulture as a gesture of partial self-sufficiency, which means that you grow your own vegetables and spices and herbs, and as much as you can, so that your dependence on the system is reduced. That's a school that we did a little later. And again, it was all about site planning, and I had already by then got into things like, issues like rainwater management, wastewater, grey water recycling, and landscape design had become a very, very dear aspect to me, and a paradigm that the office constantly, followed, irrespective of whether the client wanted it or not. The next level of our initiation into the kind of design we produce is at the cultural level. And we have multiplicity of identities, especially as Indians. We have regional identities, we have identities by virtue of our affiliation to a community, to a particular religion, to a particular customs, a set of rites and rituals, or maybe there is a professional fraternity, you are an alumni of a school. And at the top of all this, under the umbrella, is this institution called the country, the nation. And we are all bound by what I call as the Hindustani Buddhi. So this Hindustan as a kind of as an institution is constantly influencing the kind of design that we produce, because we've been born and brought up in this context, and influence is something that you don't even realize. It's so subconsciously absorbed, and it's very slow, and it's kind of just happening behind the scenes, and you're just going on kind of absorbing like a sponge whatever is happening around you. And I think the key question that at this level we always ask is, one, who are these billion plus people, given the diversity and complexity of our country, and why are we what we are? But that's not what I really want to go into. I want to look at, another set of circumstances that shape your design. But to briefly show what is the role of an institution that you study architecture, I go back to my alma mater, School of Architecture and Planning, Ahmedabad. See, we were constantly in conversation with the building, conversations on light, order, material, collision of materials, textures, colors, climate. And this was not always taught to us in the class. We just kind of learned it by being part of an extremely inspiring atmosphere. And in those days, Professor Doshi, although he had stopped teaching, but he would always come for our juries, and we would fight with each other to go on the jury panel first, so that we could hear him criticize our project. And he would also just pick up a chalk any evening he walked in, because this was second home to him, and he would start talking, and we would just not know where 5 hours had gone by. And it was that kind of, education that we got from our mentors, great seniors, super seniors. And I think that made up for a lot of learning that augmented the learning in the classroom. And then there were buildings in Ahmedabad. The city was teaching us architecture every moment. So we had complete access to Sangat, which is Professor Doshi's office. Probably as students of architecture, many of you might have visited Ahmedabad and seen these buildings for yourself. So you had a legacy of historical medieval architecture, the beautiful stepwells, and then, Sarkej Rosa. Corbusier had come and he had built many houses and the mill owners. And of course, Khan's IM was, magnum opus was right next door to School of Architecture. And we were kind of constantly visiting these places, doing our assignments. And we would also go to Professor Doshi's house on Holi, like drunken monks, after having consumed a lot of bhang. And he would treat us to fafda, which is a very typical Gujarati delicacy, I mean a snack, and jalebis. So the city where you stay, the city where you study, is also teaching you architecture if you just want to learn from it. And most important except, I think, was that we had crazy opportunities. And on the left, the top corner, that's me, acute, no, but then that's me on a ship to Finland. So I was sent as an exchange student to University of Zurich, where I stayed for a year. I studied, I worked, I traveled. And just before we went on the exchange program, the Swiss used to come and spend a semester with us. So we had already begun to sort of, have this, what do you say, a global perspective, before globalization actually became a part of our vocabulary. And the bottom, the three pictures are 2 years back. My husband, who was also on that program, and he was my batchmate. And we visited all these places, and we were on a nostalgia trip, and you could see us looking very pleased as punch. On the left side is the terrace of the Heidi Weber Pavilion that Corbusier designed just towards the end of his career. And we were working very close to the Heidi Weber Pavilion, so we used to have our lunch on the lawns outside of the building until the curator, and we would keep staring at the building, and every day we'd keep staring at the building until the curator said, "Hey, why are you eating there? Yeah, why don't you sit on the terrace?" So it became a place for our lunch. What an inspiring place, because what you do when you're not working is what defines your work culture. Think about it. So when you're having lunch, you're not doing anything, right? But then to be inspired at the time when you are, not actually doing architecture, somehow feeds your, sense of architecture when you actually go back to your drafting table and start working. The middle picture down is the hostel where we stayed. And it was in a very posh location because somebody had donated it, for this purpose. And we had students from all over the world. We had Indonesians and Africans, and of course the Americans, and a lot many, people from Europe, various parts of Europe. So I think that we also became very, very tolerant to multiple perspectives. And on the right side is the two of us standing outside the architecture block. I'm very pleased to have studied under very eminent professors at that time. So universal context, my exposure came at the age of 21 when I was living and studying and working in Switzerland. And this was an understanding of the common ground, how we are not different from the Polish or the Dutch or the Japanese, and rather than how different we are. So culture is a subset, a version of the universal. And we began to understand that there is so much common ground that, it keeps us together. And the issues that we discussed were basically very fundamental issues of safety, hygiene, relationships. Generally, everybody wants to be happy. Everybody wants, to feel that they have a purpose in life. Everybody wants hygiene. Everybody wants to have good health, etc., etc. It was also about position taking. For instance, what I mean by position taking is that, when Corbusier designed the Villa Savoy, he had a brief and then he had a vocabulary, but the position he took was that the house is a machine to live in. And that's what I mean. So different designers take positions with respect to what architectural vision they have for society. How do they want to mold society to live, to behave, to work, to think, and to conduct themselves, you know, as a society, as a kind of, and we become the custodians of these collective aspirations of people. And I think that's a very important learning, is how does one take a position on all the, you know, the critical issues that are pertaining not just to the project, but also to a much larger picture that we are, you know, addressing. And this kind of, you know, the value addition, if I may call it, comes essentially through travel. And you express, you know, you learn to sort of imbibe it intermittently, meaning from, you know, time to time. It's not something which is continuous. It can also happen in bits and pieces, of course, by studying, by working, interacting, living. And these are inspirations. And inspirations are different from influences in that, you know, they're not slow and subtle and intangible and so on and so forth. They actually hit you like a flash of lightning. And then that flash of lightning is what I call as the aha moment. And those are the ones that give you that germ of an idea, you know, that you start a project with. Those are the ones that feed a vision, a philosophy, or an ideology. And that has nothing to do with the programmatic brief or the site analysis or any of the filter, you know, checks of reality that we of course have to put our, you know, building through. So it's like, you know, what Louis Kahn says, that you should try and make your building go from the immeasurable to the measurable and back. That means you can't just, you know, be poetic in your exploration of space. You still have to make a building, and it's still got to work. It's still got to, you know, satisfy all the stakeholders. It's still got to be in a budget, etc., etc. But then once you have designed a building, always check, is it going back and addressing the vision that I started out with? Is it still having those experiential and sensorial, you know, meanings and cognitive associations that I intended in the first place? And that is what I'm going to show you in some of the projects that I visited. So I've been working for Studio Arcom. It's one of the leading practices in India. And in Arcom, I've been doing a lot of writing for them. And what we do every year is we go on a low budget backpacker style trip to various parts of the world. So we, you know, we have a very ambitious mandate of 100 buildings in 10 days. So it's like, you know, architecture bombarding you, building after building and destination after destination. And you are just kind of, you know, just kind of gulping it. And you don't have the time to process at that point, because 10 buildings in a day is a lot. And you're walking most of the time because it's low budget and your feet come free. So you have a lot of time in just looking at things and making sure, you know, you capture it in your brain or on your camera or as a sketch or whatever. But it's only when you come back and you sit on your drafting table that you reflect on it and you put it all in some kind of an order and structure. And then the learning starts getting scalable, and then you definitely apply it in whatever realm of work that you're involved in. So those of us who are practicing try to use it in our practice. Those of us who are teaching will try to translate it into our teaching practices or any content that we're sharing with our students. So we carry our tents, we carry cooking utensils, and we carry a lot of rice and things like that. That makes up the bulk of our luggage. And then we only buy perishables, and then we, you know, food is not an issue, sleeping is not an issue. The issue is architecture, and that's it. And we do anything, you know, just to be able to see more and more buildings in those 10 days. Look at me, that's me and my intern and my boss cooking on a highway somewhere in Japan. We're not allowed to do that actually. So jaldi, you know, making some pav bhaji or something, and the pav is in the bread, and then, you know, on the move we're eating, because again, eating is not the issue. But then it's fun because you're not supposed to do that. So, you know, the Indian mindset, which is completely vipareet of what it is in Japan, how much ever disciplined they are, that much indisciplined we are. So, you know, you get the kick out of also trying to see, can you get away with it or not? And yeah, so far we got away with it. But it's a lot of fun. Now, one of the projects that has made a huge impact on my life, you know, as a designer, as an architect, is this building by Zaha Hadid in Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea. It's called the Dongdaemun Design Plaza. It's a city center, clearly, and it's a huge urban design and planning project. And, even before we went to South Korea, we had a lot of opinions, typically like designers, always having a judgment on something. And honestly, most of us were not very much in awe of her vocabulary or her style of design. And we went with a kind of a prejudice already, before we even landed. But I can tell you, jab we met the building, it's one of those times when, I can't explain in words the kind of impact that it had on me. I'd just say she had pulled off a stunt. It was nothing like a daredevil pulling off a life-threatening stunt or something like that. Because I felt that, and we all felt, we shared this, opinion, was that the stakes must have been incredibly high. Billions of dollars of public money at stake, and to build something like this, and it was heavily criticized. But then we were there for half a day and half a night, and we only navigated 20% of the building. It's 5 stories high and 7 stories below the ground. And the rest of the night, we sat by the hotel window right next to it. We were, on the 17th floor. We taken a hotel, and we just sat and, sort of watched it sort of as the day came by. And it was something that we will never forget, because I think that, the challenges, as what I call them, was, see, that's the early morning picture that I've taken from my hotel room. And you can see that it looks a little different at night, and it's such an amphibious organic form. It was not at all incongruous in that environment. In fact, if you look around in the fabric surrounding it, that is the one which is incongruous. That's what we realized, is that it's poker faced, it's characterless, and it's kind of, doesn't have anything to really talk about. And then there is this building that is holding it all together. And once we went inside the building, let me tell you, there was everything happening there. Huge, massive building, and programmatically there were high-end retail shops, there was a flea market, there was high-end fine dining, there were food courts and kind of street food, there were libraries, there was museum, there was a place for children to play. And if you just imagine what it must have been to build this, because it had to be something which was very sophisticated in technology. Of course, it's a parametric systems. So massive columns, massive structural systems, so much of, programmatic, what do you say, insertions. There was even a place where mothers could go in the afternoons and sleep, because their babies had kept them awake at night. So they would just deliver the cranky babies to the staff there. And you could see in a kind of a sunken niche, from an upper level, we saw mothers sprawled, fast asleep. And there were like so many of them. So it meant that this building was really, a place that people ended up going every day for something or the other. To buy milk, to buy groceries, to take the tram. There was a tram station underground, and then to participate in all the various activities that were being conducted in this building. And so you can see, very funky eateries, crazy staircases. The internal ceiling and the outside silhouette had nothing to do with each other. They were going their separate ways. And there were, there was quirky street furniture. There were places to lounge. And this is a small little shop where you could go and design your own pen. And that is when it struck us that, hey, a pen is a kit of parts, So you could pick up anything from any of the segments and you could make your own pen. And kids were freaking out over here. And that's all of us in uniform, kind of, lounging and walking the streets. A lot of quirky street furniture, a measure of, a playfulness and naivety or kind of childishness. And then there was a huge portion that was dedicated to history. Now, South Korea, was, I think, liberated from the Japanese rule in 1945-47. Japan was bombed in 1945 in the Second World War, and India got independence also in 1947. Now, what a difference, in the way the countries have progressed. And we really need to address this issue, as to what is it that, makes us sort of lag behind in terms of the role of design in society more than anything else. So parametric design was then used by Zaha Hadid, although it began as a technological, investment, became a theory to address heterogeneity, at city level also, and it became a theory of urban design for Patrick Schumacher and Zaha Hadid. So that's a model of the Kartal-Pendrik regeneration plan. It's in Turkey, near the capital, Istanbul. And I don't know if you're aware, but as a concept, we began to understand what Zaha was trying to say is that we have so much of differentiation between us in terms of our preferences. We are not like what Henry Ford used to do in his times, build 3 cars and say, hey, take any one of them and you can go. Today, we are not going to go to a shop that only gives us 3 options. There's this ad for, I think, Amazon or Big Bazaar or something, which says to do crore products and or dikhao, and somebody's flipping. Now that's the kind of what do you say, individual preferences that we have is so different from, we want little of this, not so much of this, somewhat that, and how does an industry cater to a system where everybody wants what they want, but then you can't go tukur making handmade for each person. So you have to have a complex, highly technologically advanced system that allows you to custom design, even while, having it is streamlined within a manufacturing process. So I think it was a very humbling lesson in technology and the production of design based on the kind of technology that you are comfortable with. In South Korea, we saw a lot of work by European architects. We were surprised because this is university done by Rem Koolhaas. Then you have the Samson Museum, which was done by Mario Botta, Jean Nouvel, and also Rem. And then you had MVRDB doing the Skywalk. MVRDB are Dutch giants, they're big guys in Holland. And then Corbusier. Corbusier also designed a museum for Western culture. It's his only building in Japan. But then we found that in Japan and in Seoul, there was work that was done by leading European architects. And then we went to a place called Gangnam, a little away from Seoul. And it's like a museum of buildings, amazing buildings. It's a very elite, and it's like the Beverly Hills of Seoul. And you have all the high-end luxury brands and their buildings, announcing themselves. And you keep walking and walking and walking, and it's really Gangnam style. It was an extremely bizarre experience, looking at how different buildings can cohabit and look absolutely different from each other. And then we thought, yeah, why not? I mean, why should they always have to relate to each other? They can stand just as, individually as they want, and kind of just leave a little space and then allow the other person to do his or her jig. And it was all, sitting pretty well as a district. The most important learning for us from this trip was that there was a culture of design and there was value for design in these countries. And it meant that, somehow designers had taken on the initiative to make every problem their problem, and respond to the problem by offering solutions. And that's why, the ordinary people sort of consumed design and appreciated design, and therefore designers and architects and all realms of design, because we produce design. And I think that is something that we very much need to bring into our country, is this whole idea of how do you create a value for this field? It cannot anymore remain something which is the, entitlement of a certain section of society. It has to percolate to the ordinary people, so that, they also understand and appreciate, what design can do, and therefore appreciate us as designers who provide the, produce the design and provide it. Lot of importance given to little details, articulation by way of street signage, by way of wayfinding, the urban floor. Even the manhole covers always had something, and they were like art pieces. And it just doesn't always cost money. It's about how much importance you give, and how, aesthetics is a part of your living. It's not something which is, only for some people and only when, you have a certain quality of life. It's just part of everyday life. And I'll tell you the story of this little bench here. Very simple bench. And we observed, we didn't take pictures because it's not nice to do that. But I found a mother and child sitting in a bench, together. I saw two friends sitting here. But then the moment a stranger came and third person came and sat, that person chose to sit on this, extended portion. And it was such a simple gesture that defined the privacy and therefore the safety and a sense of wanting to continue to sit in that public place by a sheer armrest, which was just part of the structure, and that allowed two people who are close to each other, who know each other, familiar with each other, to sit in the middle section, and people who don't know each other to just sit on the other side. And it really kind of created a certain decorum or a way people behaved in public. And I think that it was very, very enduring, because it wouldn't have cost any money, extra money, to do that. It was all in the mind, and it was all how they thought about it. I'll go to the absolute opposite end of the spectrum, from Zaha Hadid's Dong Daemun Design Plaza to what I call as Poetics of Space by Tadao Ando. Now, Tadao Ando was not even formally trained in architecture. He didn't go to school of architecture. He was a boxer, he was a truck driver, he did all kinds of things. And then by just sheerly, traveling and by looking at other people's work, and he obviously had an instinct for space making, he's become one of the world's most renowned contemporary architects, and he's even won the Pulitzer Prize. And what I liked about his work throughout Japan, and I don't know how many buildings of his we saw, was that he had a vision, and that vision was, was way ahead of what the programmatic brief was for that particular project. So Louis Kahn, had said this very beautifully. Did you ever ask a building what it wants to be? And the building will answer. In a way, well, it means that we as designers, of course a building can't talk, but as designers we need to bring that value into our work. Ask a building, what it wants to be, even before it has physical presence, which means even before you get into the making of the building. This is a very, very a poignant piece of work, called the Water Temple. It's in a small pastoral town, in Japan, called Awaji. And you go there by bus, and after a certain point the muddy road starts, and you park there, and there's a little pool of lilies, and some kind of hills and some farming land and so on. And then you climb up a few steps and you go through a cemetery actually, and then suddenly you see these, this blank wall, set of walls, one which goes straight and the other one which is curved, and you just get drawn towards it. You just keep moving, okay? And then at the end of it you see this sort of hemisphere, semicircle of space, which is a pond of lilies, absolutely still. And you just keep walking along this, and suddenly in the middle of it there's a staircase, and the staircase go down, 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 down. You can't even see the other end of it. See, from somewhere halfway I've taken this picture, and you're looking up, and it's a huge flight of steps. And under this entire lily pond is the temple. It's a Buddhist temple. It's a dark place and it's a lighted place, because it's under the ground, but then there are light wells, and it's an extremely peaceful. You, even if you're not the kind of person who does a lot of prayer, you just get induced to pray there. There is something there that makes you feel the presence of a divinity. The other building that I wanted to show you was something called the Museum of Wood Culture. Now, this entire thing, the forested area, it's in a place called Kobe, up in the mountains, and it takes a while to reach there. And this entire forest had been destroyed in the Second World War. And so Japan said, we're going to reconstruct the forests. And then when they built these forests as a tribute to wood, which was a part of their culture, which was a part of their religion, which was a part of their spirituality, was kind of celebrated in this museum, which was clearly made in wood. So it's a kind of a truncated cone with an open space, and you penetrate it through a bridge. The bridge goes all the way, about half a kilometer. And then there is a kind of a pavilion where you can view. And inside, the structure was very exciting. Of course, it was a museum, so it had a lot of wooden artifacts, of how they used wood in buildings and how they used it in their screens and their, cutlery and toys and all kinds of aspects of life. But the structure was very interesting. It was not designed as a set of, columns which are interspaced equally, which is how typically we design structures. It was designed as a clump of trees, the way trees grow in forests. So you had these columns that were like a cluster with very uneven space between them, and then there was light coming from the top, and it was a reinterpretation of how light comes into a forest between a clump of trees, and was very, very obvious and yet not so obvious. And I think when you get it, when something is not so obvious and you get that, it's a very, very enriching moment, and you feel very inspired. We also did a wood workshop over there, and we learned how to, respect wood. Simply put, how to respect wood, because the way the machine works, it's a very high tech machine, and it goes at very high. The blade is, whirring at a very high speed, and if you're not, able to understand whether it's going against the grain or along the grain, the whole wooden thing can just fly all over the place. So this is what I made, a baby and a mother elephant interlocking. Was such fun, I can't tell you. And that's the pavilion, and the view was, of course, out of this world. So to me, Tadao Ando, is one person who makes concrete seem as if it is also being produced by the bowels of the earth. It's like brick or clay, when actually it's a man-made material. But the sensitivity with which he uses it and the way he positions it against the landscape is almost like it is made from a material that comes from earth. So all his buildings, we notice that. And then they do a lot of reclamation in Japan, because they often have floods and tsunamis and land gets washed away, and they just build it back. And then they make sure that it is earthquake resistant, and of course they are very good with embankments also. They have to prevent floods, and you must remember that Japan is made up of about 6,800 islands. So you always have to remember that nature is all powerful, and that nature is not something to be subdued, but not something to be feared either, but to be brought inside your lives and treated with utmost respect. And then it's going to be friends with you. See, it's a huge commercial center. Again, built from the mountains, it comes sloping down and it kind of meets the sea. And it's again built on reclaimed land. And at points, you cannot even imagine that, this is concrete. It just gels so well with the landscape. He uses a lot of natural elements in his buildings, whether it's the sky, whether it's the soil, it's the rock, it's the pebbles, it's water. And there is this whole calmness, the building is absolutely still. And the way concrete is, portrayed is completely stark, very austere, and it's brutally honest. There is no kind of, dressing it up, or there's no kind of making it look like a joker. There's no hiding its flaws, and it's there in its absolute naked sincerity. And that sort of hits you, over a period of time, that you ought to respect materials. You ought to give them a place that they deserve in the scheme of things, and you don't kind of make a fool out of them. Because imagine if somebody tried to dress you up and make you look like somebody who was completely not you wouldn't like it, right? So we need to personify materials, and we need to treat them, and then they will do wonders for us. Always framing views. On the right side, is a place where you sit and you remove your shoes and you put them on, because in the museums, they don't allow you to wear footwear. So, you don't realize also that when you're putting on your shoes, you take 5 minutes, right? And if you're a group of people, you wait for the others also to come. And then you realize that this character has actually designed these spaces with this light and this whole shadow, darkness, light, shadow, to provoke you. And what is the provocation? You've just seen a fine piece of sculpture or an art or something in the museum, and you're going to go into the next section, or you're going to go home. Okay, that's the point of repose. That's the point where you stop and you think about what you have seen. So this idea of empty spaces, called interstitial spaces, which don't have anything to do with the function. There's no, as such, a human activity, become very important in his repertoire. And I think that's again a very important learning for us, is that we tend to ignore, corridors and courtyards and all these kind of spaces which may not have a function, which may just be spaces where, you're moving from one place to another, or they just adjoining the spaces that have human activities. But then to make them into experiential spaces and to elevate the whole idea of the building, to a position where people just want to go there to be in that space. They don't have any work there. They just want to go there and feel good about being in that space. Now, isn't that an amazing thing to bring into your design? I mean, look at this. I feel that, that motorcycle is the only kind of odd man out here. And I know the boys on my group, the young boys, they all took this picture for the motorcycle. But then, it's so calm. All of it is completely in harmony. And you can't differentiate between what is man-made and what is natural. And all kinds of programmatic, briefs they have for themselves. I mean, this is a place, it's called the Museum of Fine Art. It's just a public garden in which they've made these huge, murals from small pieces of tile of all these Renaissance paintings, Michelangelo's paintings, and, you have Da Vinci's paintings. And there's water bodies, and there is, of course, a lot of greenery. And it's all a place where you can simply go and meet your friends and have a chat and have a snack or something, and you're just sitting there inspired by these huge Renaissance paintings, and you start thinking about Michelangelo. Who was he? What did he do? So it's really trying to make you be aware of what was happening throughout human history. And I thought that was one of my favorite places, because I'd never imagined that something like this can actually be conceived. And one thing about Tadao Ando is that the sketches that he makes, the initial thumbnails, the germ of an idea that he has is never lost when he makes the building. And of course, even he has to fit into a schedule. He has to have a budget. He has to satisfy all the bureaucratic red tape. And it may be less in Japan, but there is always bureaucratic red tape. And if you're building something that is commissioned by the state, you have no choice. You have to work with them. And yet, never once does he lose sight of the poetics. And that is, I think, the most inspiring thing, is that if you want, you can still, retain the essence of what you wanted to do as a vision and not get bogged down by these reality checks. Look at that, a museum of embankments, I mean, huge 1:1 sections of dams and, all kinds of flood control mechanisms. And again, the volumes are extremely stark and they're made in concrete nevertheless, but they just kind of, the scale and the way in which they want to make museums for their own people, for the next generation, was also something I felt is worth learning from. Because museums today are not just repositories of frozen moments of the past where you just go on walking. They're extremely interactive, they're extremely engaging, and they're very, very important stakeholders in the dynamics of city making, because they again represent the collective aspirations of of a particular time. And it is always important for generation after generation to know what this is in continuum, culture in continuum. Some other buildings we saw which were, designed by famous, not as famous as Tadao Ando, but this is a guy called Toyo Ito. And it's a building which is sort of, made of arches, simple, but the arches are all different. No two arches are the same. And we just wondered, I mean, what is this? And it's all concave, outside is concave, the other surface is concave. So there is a lot of technology, there's a lot of structural planning. But when you see the space, the experiential part of it is super intact. We saw a museum of models, I mean, I'm sure your generation has gotten through architecture or intends to get through architecture without making models, and we are happy with 3Ds and softwares and all. But then when we saw this, museum, we realized Oh my God, nothing can ever replicate model making and the understanding of space, the communication of what your understanding is to your clients or to the public at large. Nothing works like models. We saw a fascinating museum of models, and look, they make museums for models also. And then there we saw paint shops, we saw, all these high-end places. And again, it's the culture of design and the Kansai airport. We especially took the flight from Osaka because we wanted to see this airport. It's built on ocean, in the middle of the ocean. So you have a 5 kilometer bridge that takes you first to the, and it's a huge airport. And look at the infrastructure. All of it is on the seabed. And when the flight takes off and when it lands, in seconds you're over water. And you get this feeling when you're landing also, probably that, oh my God, are we going to land in water? But it's amazing what they've pulled off as a country. And I mean, it's just really worth visiting and learning from. Space is such a premium in Tokyo. You have the capsule tower and you have these absolutely tight, compact living spaces. It's like the train compartment, where you have these tires one above the other. So we also stayed in a capsule for one night. It's very expensive, and they'll give you a uniform, and I mean they'll give you a bath, what do you say, a robe and your night pajamas and a toothpaste and stuff, and you just slip into your capsule. You keep all your luggage in the in the lobby, and you just get this little cubby hole, but that cubby hole is amazingly anthropometric. You will never feel claustrophobic, but it's not, it's still a cubby hole, and it has everything. It has a small little TV, it has place for your alarm clock, it has a place for your mobile and stuff, and you just put your stuff there, and they'll give you slippers and a towel and this night clothes. And that's why some of them had taken a picture, because we really enjoyed that time. And the capsule hotel, the tower, housing tower, is so compact. Everything is inbuilt, and it works. That is all of us sleeping in the bus, because sleep was something which was so expensive. The food, unfortunately, never went down our palate. It did not suit us at all. So fortunately, we were carrying Indian food, and we sort of made our way through the 10 days without having to touch Japanese cuisine. So a bit of nightlife in Osaka, and a rushed visit to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just to understand, what happens to a city when it is completely destroyed. I mean, it's like ground zero. There is nothing left there. There are no people. It's completely gone. In physically, spiritually, biologically, genetically, all gone. And then it is resurrected like phoenix rising from the ashes. And what a fantastic job. I mean, very sensitively done, in a way that you remember the past, but then you remember it in a positive way, that you don't repeat the mistake rather than keeping on mourning. So there is an air of positivity also, and yet there is this whole story of just what happened at the time the bomb fell. We went to this office. It's run by Fumihiko Maki. It was amazing to visit an office. So whenever you travel abroad, you should always try to go and visit a practice, because you'll find, the rigor and discipline that they have, the kind of working methods they have, and their processes are very interesting. And there's a lot to learn from that. Fumihiko Maki had actually, done the Patna Museum with another Indian architect. And when they showed us the model of the Patna Museum, we realized that their understanding of Bihar and their understanding of Patna and the culture of Patna, which was to be represented in the museum, was far more than what any of us could have imagined to be doing justice to. And hats off, they deserve to win that competition. And very professional, but extremely sensitive to culture. And that is how you should be. You have to be cutthroat in your professionalism, but then your empathy for your end user doesn't have to go away just because you're being professional. That is, the two can very well go hand in hand. We've done crazy things like, the last night we had no money for a room. So we were sitting, spending our time in a bar, playing pool till 3:30. And then they pushed us out when they closed the bar. And then we had to sit on the road. And then we had to kind of, what do you say, just wait for the metro to start before we could leave. Have I exceeded the time, Ila? Should I stop?
Ma'am, You may finish in next few minutes because we have to close the session at 3:30 and last 5 minutes we would like to have for question
then
answer
we
session.
can, because this is just, I mean,
yeah, even we are enjoying the flow, but
yeah, just this is Teshima Art Gallery, again extremely primordial. They make you go round and round the path, the navigation path, and that's the museum. I want to leave you with this. It's a museum where you see the sky, you see the trees. There's a thread that's hanging there to make you understand that there is wind also. And then on the floor, which is slightly sloped, you have droplets of water which are programmed to come out, pop out from under the ground, and the droplet starts moving. It goes and meets up with another droplet, becomes heavier and becomes more globular. It's organic and starts dancing, and then they both move forward. And you can sit here for hours and hours and just look at the drops of water going about their journey. And you never realize that a drop of water could do so much. So that's where I am.
Yeah, very nice, ma'am. It was truly inspiring. So we have some questions. Maybe Tejaswini, you can switch on your camera now. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
So, yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such enlightening and fun experiences. Let us now take some follow-up questions. My first question will be how our culture and where we are brought up affects what kind of architect we will become.
Well, your world view is shaped. See, design is something where you respond to a set of conditions, right? You're geared to kind of address the issues that are pertaining to a context, and that context could be physical, social, political, anything. So your understanding will always come from what you have already thought of as you've grown up, the kind of what do you say, observations you've made, and the kind of analysis you do, and the kind of understandings you develop as a result of those. It's not something that just pops from the sky one fine day. It is definitely something that is built over a period of time, where you're constantly also in conversation with other people. You study, you read, you look up the internet, whatever, but your worldview is essentially shaped by how you position yourself as you grow up. And yeah, it affects, like I showed you how my own life, how it what kind of direction it took based on where I studied and where I grew up and what kind of people I roamed around with, etc.
Yes, ma'am. How much traveling affect our learning? Someone who doesn't travel much, can't they be a good architect?
Yes, of course. It's not mandatory to travel. I mean, it's just one way that you can enrich yourself. And there was a long period of time when, after I graduated, when I was studying in Switzerland, where I never had the opportunity or the money to travel. I was busy raising a family, setting up a practice. But that was a time when I was also doing a lot of work, and a lot of good work. I mean, I'm happy to say. So it's not as if you cannot be a good architect. It's just that when you want to do work which has a purpose, where the stakes are much higher. And to me, even a house, when you design, the stakes can be as high as of having a worldview. Doesn't mean that just because you're making a house, it's a small project and the issues are not complex. You could still position a house as a machine to live in, for instance. Now that's a representation of a worldview in a house. So it depends on what kind of work you want to do, how responsible, how much of the big picture you want to address. And then you augment your basic understanding, and you keep building. And there are many ways to do it. I mean, the internet has helped us a lot by not having to physically go to places, but it's still imagery. You see, I don't know if your generation understands this, but you are looking at 3D in 2D, and that's a big problem. It's only when you feel the three dimensionality of space that you really understand what space means. So I think in order to be three-dimensional in your perspective, four-dimensional, five-dimensional, you need to travel. And you can do it whenever you get the time or the money. And the money.
With time, we are seeing the change in culture and values and environment. How do you see this?
Well, yeah, I think change is a part of life. Okay, a change is good, and change also is like it's inevitable. So let's accept it that it's here to stay. The one thing that is constant is change. But it's how you know, respond to change that matters. What kind of challenges that you project when this change is coming? If you're prepared, then the change is good for you. You understand? So today we are actually living the after effects of the excesses committed in the last quarter of the previous century. Now that is a change that, you know, we inherited. Now we have to deal with this, and we have to make sure that the next change that comes in is something that is, you know, a little better than the change we faced. So the pandemic has, you know, really helped us. The pandemic is a classic example of how we adapt to change. So we always adapt, but how well prepared you are probably decides how you respond to it. So it's a good thing. There's nothing wrong in change, and you can't anyway control it.
I think we are almost, time is almost up. So I think we should close the question answer session. I'm sure we have some more questions, but maybe some other time, or we can personally send you those
Yeah,
questions.
I'm happy to answer your queries. You can email. I always answer students.
Yeah, that's
Always.
so. Let's close the session. I think Dilip would like to give a vote of thanks. Yeah, Dilip, unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. I would like to thank our respected speaker, Architect Leena Gupta, ma'am, for her excellent presentation. And yes, the webinar was very informative and comprehensive. And I appreciate and value her experience and talent for traveling and observing the traveling in built form and insight in this area. And I would also like to thank our director, Dr. Ila Gupta ma'am, for her initiative in this organizing such webinars and giving us opportunity to have expert interaction within the different kind of perspective. And special thanks to our students, faculties, and all those who have attended today's webinar, and that is on the travel and built environment, perception and learning. And finally, and the last one, my gratitude towards Amity University and our IT support team for providing a platform and helping us in the successful completion of this kind of such event. And so, thank you so much, everyone. That's it.
Thank you, Dilip.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Have a good day, everybody.
Okay. Thank you so much, Leena ma'am. We really
Thank you,
enjoyed the
ma'am.
session.
I hope so.
Thank you, Rajat. Yeah. Yeah, we did.